can we truly grasp the complexities of international relations without a deep dive into its historical bedrock? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a special CSS Breakdown deep dive that's our series focusing on key texts in contemporary security studies into Andrew J. Williams, Amelia Hadfield, and J. Simon Rofe's pivotal work, International History and International Relations. We're honing in on Chapter 1 and its powerful argument for history's indispensable role in understanding global affairs. Our mission today is, well, to really get our heads around why history isn't just some dusty, forgotten archive for international relations, or IR, but actually an essential living part of it. The authors mention this common complaint from students, that IR has become too ahistorical, too self-referential.
Yeah, like it's just talking to itself sometimes.
Exactly. And this book tries to bridge that gap. It's like thinking of history not just as background scenery, but more like the DNA of international relations. You really can't understand the organism without its genetic code.
Right.
That's a brilliant way to put it. Because this deep dive isn't just a timeline. No, it's more of an intellectual journey. We'll be exploring how different ways of doing history from, its philosophical roots way back, right up to contemporary trends, how they actually shed light on, and sometimes even change how we see core IR concepts. The authors really want to spark some new thinking, especially for people, as they say, who are baffled by IR because it can feel a bit, frontier-free. It's about giving you a better map for navigating it all.
And what I find really compelling is how they frame history in IR. They talk about this fruitful relationship, but they see them as genuinely complementary.
Right, not opposed.
Not at all. Their goal is to build a stronger, clearer picture of the international. And they do this by looking through these key themes: war, peace, sovereignty, empire, international organizations, identity, showing how history doesn't just inform these things, it deeply shapes them. Okay, so let's kick off right there. What is history, fundamentally? The authors are clear. It's not just a list of past events.
No, not at all. It's equally about the scholarly method, the inquiry we use to understand those events. So it's not just what happened, but also, how we know it happened and what we make of it.
And that how we know bit has caused some arguments over the years, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A real battleground of ideas. If you go back to the 19th century, you've got German historicism, people like Leopold von Ranke. He was aiming for something almost like scientific objectivity.
Really?
Yeah, he famously talked about uncovering history as it really was, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. He genuinely chased verifiable objective facts and, importantly, refused to bend history to fit, say, political goals. It was about pure understanding for him.
But that idea of pure objectivity, that feels like a tough goal. Did it last? Or did someone challenge it pretty quickly?
It definitely got challenged. E.H. Carr's book from 1961, What is History, was a huge moment, a real counterpunch.
What did Carr argue?
Carr basically said, look, no historical fact is ever completely value-free. It's always filtered, first by the ideas and forces of its own time, and then again by the historian looking back with their own biases and questions.
So the historian's always part of the picture.
Exactly. The key thing for IR isn't just who said what, but this whole ongoing debate about what historical truth even is. That underpins any data you might pull from the past.
So this must have really stirred things up. Facts aren't neutral. How did other historians react to Carr?
Well, the debates were pretty intense. You had G.R. Elton in '67 really defending objective truth, saying, stick to the official documents, the archives.
A more traditional view.
Kind of, yeah. But then you also had figures like Michael Oakeshott leaning more towards postmodernism. He suggested history might just be a historian's experience, meaning it couldn't really give us those broad social science generalizations. It's deeply interpretive, almost like we remake the past when we look at it.
Wow, that's quite a spectrum of views.
Yeah.
So after all that philosophical back and forth about historical truth, what's the practical takeaway for us? For you, analyzing IR today, how should we approach history?
That's the crucial question. The authors, drawing on the historian Tosh, give us 3 really useful principles, almost like a mental checklist to avoid misreading the past.
Okay, what are they?
First, implicit difference. Basically, remembering that people in the past genuinely thought differently, had different values, different hopes than we do. They weren't just like us in old clothes.
Right, avoid presentism.
Exactly. Second, context. Always rigorously putting events back into their specific historical setting. What else was going on? What were the constraints?
Makes sense. And the third?
Third is process. understanding that single events aren't just isolated blips. They're part of a bigger chronological story, a flow, and that wider flow gives them their real significance.
And if we don't use those lenses, if IR scholars ignore that difference, context, or process, what's the danger?
Well, that's where IR can really stumble. The authors call it IR's prime error. It often fails on one or all of those points.
How so?
It leads to these big generalizations that squash the past and present together, making them seem alike when they're really, really different. It might dismiss crucial details as just noise, when actually those details are key to understanding. Think about big concepts like war or sovereignty. They aren't these timeless, abstract boxes.
They change.
Absolutely. They're complex social constructs built up over time by specific historical forces. Ignoring that history is like trying to understand a complex machine by only looking at the on switch.
Okay, that paints a clear picture. So we've got a handle on history's complexities. Now, how did international relations itself actually start as a distinct academic field? And what was its initial relationship with history?
The trigger is pretty undisputed. World War I, the sheer horror and scale of it created this urgent need to understand why wars happen and, crucially, how to stop them, how to build peace.
The very practical problem-solving origin.
Very much so. And that urgency led straight to IR becoming formally institutionalized in 1919. That's when the first Department of International Politics was set up at Aberystwyth University in Wales.
And IR theory then developed through these so-called great debates. Which one really captures this tension with history we're talking about?
The authors point to the second great debate. This was fundamentally a clash over method. It put the scientific behavioralists, focused on hypotheses, quantitative data, testing things up against the more historicist, interpretative tradition, the tradition this book leans towards.
A real split over how to even study the subject.
A fundamental one, yeah. Is it about finding universal laws, like in science, or is it about deep understanding of specific historical contexts?
It's interesting because, as the authors note, the actual raw material for IR has always been political history, what historians might call diplomatic history, and political scientists, international politics.
Right.
And even though big figures like Hans Morgenthau acknowledge their debt to historians, the book argues that often IR's reliance on history goes unsaid, or maybe even gets forgotten by some in the field now.
That's a key point. And the authors really dig into this core misfit between the two disciplines. It comes down to their basic aims being different.
How so?
Well, generally speaking, historians aim to explain singular events. They use unique factors, multiple perspectives. It's what's called an ideographic approach, focus on the particular.
Okay, and political scientists.
They're usually looking for patterned behavior across lots of events. They want broad connecting themes, general principles, and they test data against theories they already have. That's the nomothetic approach, seeking general laws.
Ideographic versus nomothetic. Specific versus general, that seems like a clear divide. But the authors criticize how political scientists sometimes use history, don't they?
They do, and it's a really important critique. They argue political scientists can be guilty of a couple of things. First, when they pull data out of historical sources, they sometimes ignore the really complex context that gives that data meaning.
Taking facts out of context.
Basically, yes. And second, maybe more subtly, when they use facts that historians have already analyzed and interpreted, they sometimes forget that the historian chose and shaped that data to answer historical questions, not necessarily IR theory questions.
So the data isn't raw. It's already cooked, in a way.
Exactly. Cooked for a different meal, you might say. And using it uncritically can lead to, as the authors put it, inaccuracy and distortion.
Okay, so we see the potential pitfalls. But if we look bigger picture, the authors also suggest this division between history and IR might be overblown. What are the similarities they point to? Where's the common ground?
Well, one really fundamental similarity is that both fields are ultimately searching for causes. E.H. Carr nailed it when he said, "The study of history is a study of causes." Historians want to know why things happened. They look for clear reasons, patterns.
Which sounds a lot like what political scientists are doing, even if their methods differ.
Precisely. The goal, understanding causality, is shared, even if the path taken looks different on the surface.
But if the paths are so different, ideographic versus nomothetic, how does that shared goal lead towards rapprochement, towards coming together?
Because that distinction, nomothetic versus ideographic, it isn't some rigid, absolute wall between them. Political scientists need the specific historical details to even see their patterns. You can't generalize from nothing.
Right, the specifics build the pattern.
Exactly, and historians. They rely on broader patterns and context to make sense of the details they study. The authors have a great line. Broad patterns become clear only through a mastery of the details. The detail isn't just there for its own sake, it illuminates the pattern. It's like piecing together a mosaic. You need every tiny tile, but you're doing it to see the whole picture.
And methodologically, are the lines blurring now too?
Oh, definitely. You see economic and social history using tons of quantitative data, testing hypotheses, much like social science. The French Annals School has been doing this for ages, looking at long-term structures.
And on the IR side?
Well, political scientists are increasingly using techniques like process tracing. That means digging deep into specific historical cases to build or test theories, really engaging with the how and why of particular events. It's much more historically grounded.
Are there bigger intellectual shifts helping this along too?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got the ideational turn in IR, a much greater focus now on values, norms, identities, not just power politics. That requires understanding historical context.
That's not.
And in history, there's the linguistic turn, building on Carr's idea of history as that unending dialogue between the past and the present. It emphasizes interpretation, meaning how language shapes our understanding. Even traditional diplomatic history is getting more theoretical scholars, like John Lewis Gaddis are famous for bridging history and IR theory.
So it sounds like conditions are really ripe for these fields to work more closely together. A perfect storm for rapprochement, as the authors put it. But is there a catch? A condition?
There is. The authors argue that IR scholars still need a greater commitment to using history more often and, crucially, more accurately. It's not just about sprinkling in historical examples.
It's about method.
It's about moving towards what they call conditional generalizations, theories that are flexible, that acknowledge historical context and variation, rather than sticking to these rigid, universal claims that often just don't fit the messy reality of the past.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's broaden our view now. We've talked about history generally, but the study of history itself has different branches. How have these evolved, and what do they offer IR? Let's start with the classic, diplomatic history.
Right. Diplomatic history was really the bedrock for a long time. It tended to operate within a realist framework, focusing on states, elites, diplomats, presidents, kings.
The high politics.
Exactly. Statecraft, power balancing, treaties, alliances. It relied heavily on official government archives, and it was central, for instance, in dissecting the causes of World War I, including all those arguments about the war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay, so from that fairly elite-focused view, how did international history emerge and differ?
International history grew out of diplomatic history, but deliberately cast a much wider net. It kept the traditional strengths, archival research, attention to diplomacy, but integrated insights from loads of other fields. Economic history, social history, cultural, intellectual, even social sciences.
So broadening the agenda, how did that change what historians looked at?
In several key ways. First, there was this post-WWI liberal consensus pushing the need to understand peace, not just war, leading to work like the English School and IR focusing on international society. Second, the scope just blew up. Beyond politics and strategy to include things like ideology, economic policies across borders, how whole societies interacted, suddenly concepts like identity, empire, decolonization became really central.
It wasn't just about states anymore.
Less so, yeah. Third, they started seeing the international system itself as dynamic, with its own logic, not just the sum of what big powers did, thinking about paradoxes like, the power of the weak.
Interesting.
And fourth, they looked inside states' more societal determinants. How do domestic things like elections, media, business interests, cultural attitudes actually shape foreign policy, that whole area of linkage politics?
Okay, the lens keeps widening. Next up, global and world history. Where does that take us?
Even broader. This has older roots, maybe figures like Toynbee or Spengler, but it got a big boost from the Annals School in France, people like Brodel looking at longue durée, those deep, slow-moving currents of history, not just events.
Right, geographical factors, climate, deep economic structures.
Exactly. And the Cold War, being a truly global conflict, really pushed this perspective too, thinking about interconnectedness on a planetary scale. David Reynolds' book, One World Divisible, captures that well.
And within that, you mentioned critical global history. What's the focus there?
Critical global history often aims to rewrite history from the perspective of the marginalized, the victims. Think of someone like Tzvetan Todorov, who connects the conquest of the Americas back in 1492 to the roots of 20th century totalitarianism.
Wow.
Yeah, it's about understanding the darker side, the logic of oppression, maybe highlighting things like a global history of genocide. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths.
Which brings us finally to transnational history. How does this fit in? It sounds similar to global history.
It often overlaps, definitely. Transnational history specifically focuses on the connections, the border crossings. It looks at how ideas, people, goods, capital, social movements, even diseases flow across national boundaries, linking regions and societies in complex ways.
So it's about the links themselves.
Precisely. It tracks the networks and flows that transcend the nation-state container.
So putting it all together, diplomatic, international, global, transnational history, how does this whole expanding landscape help someone studying IR today?
It offers so many new avenues for cross-fertilization. Transnational history, for example, lets us dig into how international organizations actually function through things like epistemic communities, networks of experts, a concept IR scholars themselves developed.
So history can provide the empirical grounding for IR concepts.
Exactly. It revisits ideas from IR thinkers like Keohane and Nye about interdependence, but does the deep historical spade work. This kind of micro-level historical research is absolutely vital for understanding the big macro-level patterns that IR is often concerned with. You need the details to really grasp the structure.
Okay, let's wrap up with one last, maybe challenging idea. Postmodernism. It questioned the very idea of objective truth in history. How did that impact things?
Well, it certainly caused a stir. Some accused postmodern thinkers like Hayden White or Keith Jenkins of reducing history to just fanciful storytelling,
Yeah.
undermining the whole enterprise.
Get it?
Historian Richard Evans pushes back strongly. He argues, convincingly I think, that historians, especially diplomatic historians dealing with ambiguous documents and differing interpretations, have always known their work was interpretive. They never really believed meaning was totally fixed or transparent.
They understood the ambiguity already.
They lived with it. They knew a treaty meant different things to different signatories. The dialogue, as Carr said, is always between the historian asking questions now and the significance embedded in the document then.
So what's the final takeaway then? For the relationship between history and IR, what's the core message from this chapter?
It circles back to that idea of history as an unending dialogue between the past and the present. It's not about finding the single final truth. It's about engaging constantly with the past, understanding its meanings from where we stand now.
And for IR?
The big lesson is, as we recognize more and more factors matter, ideas, culture, non-state actors, deep structures, we increasingly need to cross-fertilize the academic genres. We need history's depth. We have to accept that our understanding will always be approximate, somewhat subjective. We should take the valid postmodern critiques about interpretation seriously, but without giving up the search for understanding. We simply need both the micro details and the macro patterns. You can't have one without the other to make sense of our world.
So we've definitely reinforced the book's core argument. History isn't optional for IR, it's indispensable. By really engaging with its depth, its nuances, its evolving methods, IR scholars, and anyone interested in global affairs, can get a much richer, more grounded understanding.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. What historical details, what specific contexts might you be overlooking when you think about current global events? And how could digging into those specifics maybe change your whole perspective on the bigger picture?
Keep asking those questions. Keep digging deeper. That's where the richest understanding lies. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.